Module 2. So we ended with looking at the different components or the sociological perspective would take into account. So we're going to go through each one of those in more detail. So I do have a YouTube video posted, which I'm going to embed into this module that explains culture. But I also want you to think how you would define culture and what does culture mean to you, and making sure that you're recognizing your own kind of personally, like where you come from and what, like you could think about the culture that you grew up in or things like that. So culture refers to, Culture refers to everything that characterizes our species. So culture is learned and transmitted from one generation to the next. And so you may have experiences. So if you grew up in a family where you knew your grandparents, like your grandparents might have shared with you some like these cultural traditions. So for instance, my family, so my grandmother, my baba, I should say, she was Ukrainian. And so she shared with me a lot of her cultural traditions, and many of them were surrounded food. So I grew up making pierogies and cabbage rolls and celebrating like a lot of like the Ukrainian holidays and Ukrainian Christmas and things like that. And I learned a lot of those things from her. So culture is like really important and to people and to us. And a lot of times culture is like celebrated with food. But culture is also is socialized. And so we learn kind of like our social norms through culture, which I'm going to go on to explain that in a little bit more detail in a couple minutes. But our culture shapes how we interpret the world around us. So potentially we might have students in this classroom that came from a completely different culture. So maybe we have international students that are coming from somewhere outside of Canada or like outside of even North America. And for us, Western culture might be something totally new to them, right? So like we can look at how some cultures are very individualistic, meaning that there's a lot of emphasis on the individual and making sure that you take care of your own needs and that you're making yourself happy and things like that, versus like a collective culture where you're looking at what's good for the group, that kind of thing. So culture is also has its ideas and beliefs and values by the way we live our lives. So within culture, there might be different like religious affiliations or religious beliefs. There might be different standards, different social roles, right? So we learn through our culture different gender norms and gender roles that we take on, which we're going to go and dive into that into like more detail as we look at women and how the socializing of how we're socialized into our gender roles and things like that, and how that affects our health and how that affects how we advocate for our health and things like that. Culture is also actively valued by social groups. So some cultures potentially might be more valued than others in our society. So we might see a value of Western culture versus potentially, we ignore like indigenous cultures or things like that. So sometimes our society values one culture more than another. And we're going to kind of go through that, and we're going to talk about how that can be very harmful for people and how that can influence health as well. The social institutions, culture shapes the social institutions that shape our lives. So our social institutions are also embedded in our culture, and culture is also something that's always changing. So our culture is not stagnant. Culture changes from generation to generation, and it's something that is very fluid. So there's different types of culture. So then we have non-material culture. So within our culture, we have what are called norms. So this is a standard pattern, especially for social behavior that's typical or expected of the group. So for me, when I talk about social norms, I use the example of an elevator. So right now, I'm not used to lecturing sitting down in my office. This is really weird for me, but I usually would get up and show you my example. But I want you to think right now, how many people in this classroom had a parent or guardian have an elevator talk with them? Probably none of you, right? But somehow we learned that when you get on an elevator, you always face the door. So when you walk into the elevator, if you were to walk into a crowded elevator and like think about your experience with elevators pre-COVID, because elevators aren't really designed for social distancing. So pre-COVID, if you walked into a full elevator and you faced the people behind you instead of facing the door and facing the buttons, and you went up like 10 flights of stairs, you would make every single person in that elevator extremely uncomfortable because you are violating a social norm, right? So imagine that. So you walk in and you face the people and you stand there and you're going up these flights of stairs. Everybody in that elevator would be like, what is this person doing, right? Unless you know them. So that's a social norm that you probably never really recognized. But if someone were to break that, everyone would be uncomfortable. Another example of social norms would be eye contact. So some cultures, it is offensive to make eye contact. Whereas in our culture, eye contact is a way to show somebody that you are listening and you're paying attention to them and you're engaged in what they're saying. So that's where I have that here. So social norms are almost always invisible until we violate them. And we start socializing them almost immediately from birth. Culture is also shaped by our values. So that's a person or society's principles or standards of behavior. So one's judgment of what's important in your life. So when I think about my values, one of the first things that I value is my family. So I love my family. I would do anything for them. I value my family time and quality time with my family. Other things that I value are like honesty and integrity and working hard and things like that. So each person will have like their own set of values that is often influenced by their culture, but also by their family and how you were brought up and things like that. Beliefs. So this is a trust or faith in something, confidence in something, in someone or something. So our beliefs are influenced by our culture, and some of those might be just like how you view other people and your beliefs in that, but also could include beliefs in a religious affiliation or God or things like that. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about is symbols. So a symbol is an object or a word or action that stands for something with no natural relationship, and it's culturally defined. So one of the ways that we use symbols in culture is through language. So culture is shaped by language. So I have a little tidbit there, but there's 6,912 known living languages, and the diversity is caused by isolation. So most languages have different symbols for each letter, word, or phrase, and the use of symbols is adaptive. So that means that humans can learn to associate new symbols to a concept or new concepts with a symbol. So language is symbolic, and language plays a huge role in culture. And then we have material culture. So these are all the tangible items created by society So all created physical items are made as a reflection of non-material culture. So in turn, they become prompts of social cultural change. So one thing that we can think about and how that has profound change on our culture is cell phones. So I have mine right here. And currently my microphone's broken, so I'm waiting to get a new one. And then I'll be doing more Instagram stories and things like that. But cell phones have significantly changed our culture. So I have at the bottom here that many people have now expressed the skill of being able to text while maintaining eye contact. So think about, I remember growing up. So when I was a kid, growing up, we had a home phone. It was attached to the wall, and I knew every one of my friends' home phone numbers. Now, many of us don't even know our own phone number, let alone the phone number of like their significant other or family member, because we just use speed dial. So if you think about like the impact that cell phones have had on even like social media and how we're connected now as a globe. So I'm guessing many of you have Instagram and Facebook on your phone, and how you don't see people often. Like it's hard. I have TED Talks on this. I could potentially link this, but people struggle to even stay off their phone while they're stopped at a red light. So as soon as we're alone or as soon as we are bored, we pick up our phone and we go to something. So some of you might be currently on Instagram or Facebook or something other than this site while you're watching this lecture, right? So our phones have significantly changed like how we function. A study conducted by the United Nations found that globally, more people have access to a mobile phone than a toilet. So think about what that says about our values, right? So obviously, cell phones have significantly changed our culture, and they say a lot about our values. So cultural relativism is the idea that no cultural standpoint is privileged over another. So in this course, we're going to try to recognize, or do our best to recognize, that all cultures have something different that they bring, and that no culture is superior to another's, but that our culture, our own culture, is going to shape our perspective and our view of different things. So the last 2 slides or 3 slides that I have here are social institutions. So social institutions are specialized cultures of social positions, statuses, roles, norms, and values, agencies and organizations that provide for specific needs that cannot be provided by individuals on their own. So they're more enduring features of social life. So there's different examples of social institutions, but one of the social institutions that we're all part of is education. So Sioux College is a social institution. It is a higher level education center, and it reflects a lot of our culture and our values and our norms, right? So in our culture, we value education and higher education, and that is shaped by social institutions. So other examples of social institutions are our government. So our government regulates our laws, services. We also have protections under our government. Education, law and justice, so police, protection, and social order are all part of social institutions. Health and welfare, so healthcare and disease prevention. So public health has been something that's been in the news lots, and they've had a huge stance on COVID-19 and a huge role in that, but also our healthcare and our hospitals and our medical institutions also are playing a huge role. Religion and churches and religious centers, those are also social institutions. Economics are part of social institutions as well. And then the family and the home. So it's been stated that the home is actually the most dangerous place for women, with the majority of female homicide victims worldwide being killed by partners or family. So the last thing we're going to talk about is society and personal life. So the role of the family. So support networks are extremely important, and that's something that we will be looking at as we go through this course. So we'll be talking about the importance of having social support and what happens to individuals who don't have social support and how that influences health. So we know that loneliness can actually, there's some new data out there that suggests that loneliness can be as damaging to our health as smoking. So we recognize that having a strong social support network, and part of that is as a family, is extremely important. Sports and leisures, we'd also look at that as part of the sociological perspective. And under society and personal life, we have media. So a quarter of the world's population is now on Facebook. So now that currently there's more than 19 million Facebook users in Canada. So more than 14 million Canadians check their newsfeed every day, and more than half of all Canadians check Facebook at least once per month. 9.4 million Canadians are using Facebook on mobile devices such as a tablet or a smartphone. So social media gets more powerful as it grows. So social media has a huge influence on our society and also on our personal life and how we stay connected. So that wraps up the end of Module 2.